let's get started. We're focusing this week on the causes of the American Revolution. There are a number of them, and so we'll go through this assignment that goes through several different primary sources, sort of reviewing the different causes. But the big picture really is all about monarchy. And some monarchs are popular, some kings and queens are very popular, some not so much. This guy's the main sort of character of the revolution from the British side. His name is King George III, and he was historically very unpopular. Um, he was unpopular for a variety of reasons, not just in the colonies, but also at home. Particularly after the American Revolution, he really struggled to sort of maintain his control, maintain his rule. One of the major consequences, one of the major effects of the American Revolution was the French Revolution, which happened a few years later. It had a lot of similar shared values and principles, but it had the addition of the guillotine. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the guillotine, but it is a very public, very brutal way of killing someone for public executions. And so King George III saw his peer, King Louis, murdered in the streets in Paris. And so after that, he was very afraid, very reluctant to get involved in anything in particular that might cause problems for him. And eventually he was sort of pushed to the side and replaced by others in his circle towards the end of his life. It was well acknowledged, widely acknowledged, that he had sort of lost it by the end of his life, mentally speaking. And so I asked you to think a little bit about pros and cons of a monarchy. There aren't a ton of things in favor, except sometimes there are good kings. And a lot of us, I think, over the past 4 years in the United States have wondered, like, was it a good thing that Obama had to leave office? Perhaps he could have stayed. Now, I'm not in favor of lifetime appointments, generally speaking, but when there's constant or frequent changes in power, there can be a lot of tumult, right? When Joe Biden takes office, he'll be doing a lot of work to kind of undo the work of Donald Trump. And so there is an argument that lots of transitions of power can be unhealthy for a country. But ultimately, most of us, certainly in the United States, understand that monarchy isn't a great system. And so the American Revolution is, in the biggest sense, just a response to that, just a rejection of monarchy, especially a monarch that is far away, that is distant, that isn't really close to them either physically or sort of ideologically. And so now I want to look at the first document. This is a review of stuff we talked about last week, but I'm focused especially on the French and Indian War here. We looked at the Join or Die cartoon by Ben Franklin. And so this question asks you to look for two effects of the war that escalated tension, not just effects of the war broadly, but specific effects that escalated tension, that made it more likely for the Americans and the British government to have a conflict, to go to war. And so as you look through the document, the first thing to note, the war is extremely expensive. Now, by itself, that's not an effect that actually escalated tension. What escalated the tension was the imposition of taxes. Many American patriots had their new rallying cry: no taxation without representation. Now, in some ways, it makes sense for the colonists to pay for their own defense, right? Because the expenses were coming from protecting the colonists from French and Native American forces. However, the British government's imposition of taxes without any participation from the colonists, any chance for them to speak or contest or have a voice in their representation, made the colonists feel very disenfranchised, like they weren't part of the process. And so that led to American colonists really being frustrated, and that refrain was very, very popular: no taxation without representation. And secondly, I always like to take advantage of these sort of key transitional phrases. When you see the word secondly, you can be pretty confident that you're about to get the second part of your answer. British attempts to limit westward expansion. British attempts to limit westward expansion by colonists further angered the colonists. So it tells you right there, angered and tension, right, are words that sort of go together. And so it's important to understand these two things. First, the imposition of taxes. Now, there are a bunch of specific taxes that come. Some of them are included in this document: the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Intolerable Acts, lots and lots of different types of taxes, but the big picture is the same. It's an attempt by the British government to extract money and resources from the colonies. And then secondly, the Proclamation of 1763. Think back to last class, we talked about how that line was sort of an imaginary border between the colonies and what the British called Indian country on the sort of western side of the Appalachian Mountains. It was a totally unenforceable rule, and it frustrated the colonists because it was another top-down decision that didn't include them, that they didn't get to participate in, and ultimately it took away resources from them. It took away land and opportunities which colonists either had bought or had intentions of buying, and ultimately it was largely ignored, but it did absolutely build up the tension. So that's sort of the background of the French and Indian War leading into the American Revolution. But the American Revolution is sort of a slow burn. And so another important cause that I want to talk about, and we'll just go over these two documents, but I wanted to talk about mercantilism a little bit. This is an important vocabulary word. The root is merchant. A merchant is somebody who imports, exports, somebody who trades. And I liked this definition of mercantilism quite a bit. It's the belief that a nation's wealth can be increased by the control of trade. The British government thought they could make the most money by really managing trade very carefully, particularly in the context of their colonies. The idea is that the colonies, the United States, or would soon be United States, existed just for the benefit of Great Britain, and not just the sort of broad benefit, but specifically the financial benefit. And so ultimately, the British sort of used the American colonists as tenants, as people who paid rent for the privilege of sort of existing under the British umbrella of protection. This looked like raw materials being shipped directly from the American colonies to England to be processed, whether that was cotton to be made into clothes or other things of that nature. It also included strict management of transportation, which you see in this cartoon. The British required that anything that was shipped be shipped on British ships, ships that could be taxed by the British government. Any cargo, any supplies, any shipments that were sent between England and the colonies, of course, were taxed quite heavily. And so the Navigation Acts, frankly, aren't super important. They are one of the many laws the British government put in place to sort of tamp down, to put really careful sort of controls and manage the colonies in a way that was heavy-handed and ultimately led to a lot of frustration. So the definition for the policy of mercantilism we just talked about, it's just the idea that essentially the colonies exist to make money for the mother country, and they're like tenants who pay rent. In terms of the Navigation Acts and mercantilism contributing to the Revolutionary War, well, it's all about control. The revolution was ultimately a rejection of that sort of monarchical control of the colonists. They said, we don't want to be ruled by a king who's far away, who may not have our actual interests in mind. And so ultimately, the Navigation Acts are one more way to kind of exert control over the colonists that was extremely unpopular. The other documents here include some talk about the Stamp Act in 1765. The Stamp Act was probably the most unpopular tax that was passed by the British government. It meant that any newspaper, any letter, anything printed on paper or anything like that needs to have a stamp that costs money, in the same way you'd put a stamp on an envelope now. Of course, a stamp today gets you transportation via the postal service. Not the case at the time. The Stamp Act was just one more way to extract money, to extract resources. There's some controversy, some debate over the Stamp Act in document 3B and 3C. The Stamp Act really was an escalation in terms of the tension, because a lot of the colonists refused to pay. They gave a really hard time to the stamp collectors, even in some cases tarring and feathering. Tarring and feathering, literally, tar like you'd see on roads, covering somebody with hot tar, which I'm sure is very painful, and then covering them with feathers. It had the dual effect of sort of scaring people away, scaring away the tax collector especially, but also making a really public spectacle and embarrassing somebody. And that was absolutely a key part of why the colonists did it. That led, as we talked about last week, to the incident known as the Bloody Massacre on King Street. You see this engraving from Paul Revere, just as a quick review. Then Common Sense from Thomas Paine, which is a pamphlet that really did a lot to sort of motivate and energize the colonists behind the revolutionary cause. You can see the year 1776. This was the final sort of turning point to get people armed and ready to fight. And then the Declaration of Independence by our friend Thomas Jefferson is the sort of final straw, where the colonists declare to the public, to the king, that they are no longer willing to be governed, and they are declaring their independence as sort of a new country. So that's all for this assignment. I'll pause here for questions.